Good morning. Thanks for getting out of bed this morning. It occurred to me that there's probably two ways to think about this time slot. One is the Saturday morning, which is too early to get people out of bed to attend. And then the other is the people immediately following Peter Eisenman. So I thought that we'll consider ourselves the headliners for Peter Eisenman. So my name is Adam Fure. I'm an assistant professor of architecture at the University of Michigan. I will be moderating this session with Kristy Balliet, who's an assistant professor at Ohio State, and we'll be joined by a great group of panelists: Andrew Atwood from UC Berkeley, Kelly Bair from UIC, Brennan from Yale, Andrew Holder from University of Michigan, and Kyle Miller from Syracuse University. So Kristy and I will begin by presenting the Possible Mediums project. This is something that Kristy and I founded and organized, have been organizing with Kelly Bair and Kyle Miller. Since the conversation is, it's a conversation to follow a project and maybe unpack the implications of a project. So we will present that project, what we've done, for those of you unfamiliar, and then we'll jump into a discussion. So the backstory is that the four of us knew each other from graduate school. We all went to UCLA in the sort of mid-2000s. And by 2011, we had all found ourselves teaching in the American Midwest. All of us at our current schools. Kyle at that time was at Kentucky. So as we began traveling to everybody's school and sitting on reviews and getting to know the faculty, we also found that there was a wealth of young faculty at each school that were, I think, challenging the conventions of design. So they were working in mediums that seemed new, seemed unfamiliar. That plus changes of administration, new deans and chairs at those schools meant that there was something happening in the middle. And we wanted to put together an event that would sort of mark that moment and hopefully kind of organize and mobilize that momentum. So in doing so, we planned our first conference, which took place at Ohio State, which Kristy will walk us through. But in organizing the conference, we had to take a kind of close look at the work of that young faculty, the generation that we were a part of, and try to think about what are its commonalities, what are the shared problems, how are people thinking about their work, talking about their work, producing their work. This came out a little bit after that, but it's related to what we were doing and how we were thinking about design at that moment. So this is a list from Hilary Sample and Michael Meredith's book, Everything All at Once, but this is a list from Michael's essay in that called Post-Medium Specific Architecture, where he makes the case that there's no longer a single architecture, but many architectures. And he presents this list of sort of genres of architecture, which are meant to show that there's no one way to approach architecture. There's no better way to approach architecture. There's a kind of flat list of possibilities, and people can just sort of pursue their own subgenre. This resonated with us. Again, this came a little bit after, but they've been making similar claims before, that we felt like there was multiple kind of genres being produced through our work. So we wanted to add to this that there's no more medium, only mediums, which I think goes along with the post-medium specific argument. And there's no more project, only projects. So with this, we tried to sort of answer some questions which would be presented by the challenge of Michael's assessment that there's 29 even possibilities. So we wanted to both recognize this diversity, but then also figure out how to organize it, how to mobilize it, so that people weren't just existing in their isolated niches, speaking to themselves, but you could actually mobilize this diversity so that it was kind of mutually beneficial for all. So that led into our thinking of the conference, which Kristy will walk us through now.
Sorry. Good morning. So I would again like to extend a thank you to all of you for being here. I'd like to thank David and Lola and the ACSA for hosting this discussion and for offering much feedback on the project, and to all of those that have contributed to this project within this room and beyond. In the context of the super session this morning, and in the interest of getting us to a discussion of possible curriculums, I will present the workshops, discussions, exhibitions, and events as an overview of what we have learned. As Adam indicated, the initial ambition was to magnify the design culture and discourse that was happening within our schools. The inaugural event, a regional conference that took place in Knowlton Hall at The Ohio State University, was in February 2013. The conference brought together 18 designers, 120 students from 4 different universities, and invited critics to participate in design workshops and formal discussions surrounding the questions of mediums in contemporary architecture. The original poster intentionally fronts the work, look, and feel over the individual, a collection of artifacts hanging together for the first time, reminiscent of an inaugural music festival. Banding together allows the Possible Mediums group to forward shared disciplinary concerns. Since the term medium is specific and open, defined simultaneously as means, material, format, and projection, it sets up a series of questions that ties our work together. How do you make it? How do you draw it? How do you talk about it? What are its histories? What are its effects? Who is its audience? Many believe that architecture is in a state of crisis. To such parties, architecture's current diversity indicates a lack of practical, ideological, or pedagogical purpose, threatening the field's relevance, even its existence. As young practitioners wholly committed to our discipline's longevity, we refuse to accept projections of architecture's demise. Possible Mediums is our effort to assure and shape collective possible futures. A quick scan of the original Possible Mediums roster evidences the range of mediums relevant for architectural today. Some technological in nature, like robotics, digital fabrication, interactive sensing technology, custom machines. Others more conventional, as in architectural models, materials, drawings, and some appropriated from outside the discipline, such as fashion, toys, comics, balloons, and more balloons. The Possible Mediums project was initially structured around medium-based themes that are in constant flux and subject to change based on our current discussions. The original 4 were excessive volumes, figural projections, tactile objects, and active models. This structure reflects our approach to understanding and organizing contemporary architectural discourse. These 4 mediums were discussed in organized panel discussions intermittently scheduled throughout the 4-day event in an effort to highlight, discuss, and extend these provocative trends. These discussion sessions enabled students outside the workshop series to hear from the workshop leaders and engage in a critical dialogue. As you can see here in a rough map of Knowlton Hall, the layout and the timing of events were choreographed to foster a rhythm of discussion and making. So all of the panel discussions happened here in the large open steps. And there were 12 simultaneous workshops that occurred in the open volumes of Knowlton Hall adjacent to those stairs. This reinvented the academic conference model by pulling the discussion out from behind closed doors and into the realm of active discussion. This presented This represented our view that conventional mediums of architectural production were rapidly changing. The workshop leaders led students in a range of design exercises that challenged architectural conventions by either going outside the discipline to seemingly unrelated fields like designing kites, bagpipes, and comics, or steering traditional mediums toward optical riddles and architectural modeling to produce perceptually infinite interiors. Each workshop leader was paired with a group of students from the 4 host institutions, enabling a direct connection between design thinking and active learning. A few examples will give you a sense of the range. The workshop here, led by David Freeland and Brennan Buck, titled Flight Pattern, studied how spatial and perceptual variability enabled by computation can be applied to the development of space frame kites. The workshop investigated these space frames as potential architectural structures, trading their modularity for subtle modulation to invite new airborne behavior and field-based effects. Here, Angie Coe works with a group of students speculating on the most robust animal figures in the workshop entitled Critters. The workshop investigated topotypes, architectural fragments, and spatial hybrids outside of familiar typologies, which straddle a context, topo, and an abstract organizational type. They thought about canon, hybrids, mutants, and special powers. They constructed a rotating roster of non-ideal types using machine tools in our shop and idea tools like games. Here, Andrew Holder teaches techniques for casting fat characters with plaster, balloons, and basswood dowels. Students participating in Andrew Holder's workshop, Fat Matters, cast a series of characters that hug, snuggle, and co-populate their way toward the production of space. Andrew Atwood's workshop, and projections, within the active models group, uses projection as an excuse to combine spectacle and geometry in an effort to clear productive space for architecture and search for references and associations not typically associated with either geometry or spectacle or architecture. In both design and discourse, the conference results demonstrated the profound potential of an expanded conception of architectural mediums. It expanded the pedagogic model of the technology seminar through the model of open testing. In the context of this, in this discussion, we think it's important to kind of look at each event and think about what we have learned in preparation for the curriculum that we have developed for today. So a lot of these are shots that students were tweeting, posting, and hashtagging throughout the event. So a lot of these are perceptions of the people that were experiencing this event. So what we learned, that space and format impact knowledge. That students today are adept at short-term intensive learning and skill retention. That questions of history, theory, and representation are embedded in every medium. That full immersion is favored over an a la carte menu. Learning takes many forms, and productive disruption to a curriculum permanently alters a student's point of view. We learned that pulling the architecture conference out of the auditorium and into plain sight is a better way to stay underground. We may have heard that advice once before in this conference from Jason Payne. We also learned that snuggling bricks are the best mementos, as soon as the exhibition and conference closed, these bricks found themselves in offices and desks around Knowlton Hall and throughout the Midwest. We also learned that sassy figures talk to us. Sorry, that says use, should say us. So at the conclusion of the conference, as we're thinking about what we learned, we also got a lot of great feedback from mentors and critics that were very much a part of the project. And one that I think stands out to us and that we refer back to, and I think will be related to the curriculum that we're proposing today, is a quote or as a comment by Jeffrey Kipnis, that the students at the conference were utterly transfixed by their respective workshop projects, and the considerable individual energy of each team welled into an extraordinary collaborative sociology among all involved. Think Woodstock. So with that, we were sort of inspired and energized by something that had become bigger than we had initially imagined. And so in order to extend the results of the conference, we began working to prepare and ultimately secure a Graham grant. We launched a successful Kickstarter campaign, thanks to many colleagues and friends, many in this room today, in order to enable further events. So I'll just take a minute and show you a video that we put together to kind of mark that moment before we dive into the final set of events. Oops.
The Possible Mediums Project is a series of events showcasing design investigations based in speculative architectural mediums. It was initiated 1 year ago when 4 designers teaching and working in the American Midwest came together to promote novel design trends emerging at their schools and across the country. It was clear that the conventional mediums of architectural production were changing. Comics and toys were showing up alongside perspectives and models. Orthographic drawings were crafting optical tricks, while digital drawings were exploding into vibrant vector fields. Machines were not only being used, but built from scratch. From plaster casts of fat characters to geodesic kites, designers were actively expanding architecture's mediums in order to captivate new audiences. To rally this fresh wave of speculative architecture, the original 4 teamed up with 16 designers leading these trends. And the Possible Mediums Project was born. The inaugural event revolutionized the academic conference, putting design out front in a series of dynamic workshops and panel discussions. Hugely successful in both format and content, the conference demonstrated the need for further dissemination. The next phase of the Possible Mediums Project is a traveling exhibition that will feature new pieces from each designer grouped into 4 categories: active models, excessive volumes, figural projections, and tactile objects. The exhibition will share this provocative work with a national audience and provide a backdrop for future events, workshops, and discussions.
Okay, well, since I'm here, I can tell you about the next stage personally, and we don't have to watch the rest of the video. So the next phase was indeed through a lot of support, the Possible Mediums exhibition that took place in January of 2014, in an exhibition that featured new pieces from each designer that had been involved in the Possible Mediums initial project. The type of research that you see here, the type of research can be seen here in Ellie Abrams' work, such as Peep, Peep. The work plays with the unexpected. What begins as a set of discrete objects suddenly dissolve into an infinite field of perception. These are views from the opening night. Go back just for a second. As we were working on the exhibition, we recognized that it was important to design to design the exhibition to both present research and host events throughout the duration of the exhibition. So as the project developed, we learned that the space and format impacted knowledge, and if the initial event hosted an exhibition within, this exhibition was designed to host events within it. So throughout the exhibition, we hosted workshops, including Jimenez Lai's Plan Archipelagos. Here, the participants produced an archipelago of supersized architectural plans that were scattered across the exhibition space. Akin to the loose-fit plan typologies of Sana, the workshop students performed journalistic analysis of 50 modern house plans to produce large-scale combinatory augmentations and caricatures. These plans were plotted and selectively placed around the possible mediums exhibition, producing a landscape of carpets framing alternative realities in orthographic projection while highlighting drawing conventions, the language of lines, and the politics of shapes. A second workshop, hosted by Kelly Bair and Michael Lovrich, entitled Shirts and Skins, extended the lineage and breathes new life into the teepee, a structure that is as much an event as it is a constructed tactile object. Shirts and Skins adopts the nomadic sensibility of the possible mediums exhibition through the construction of a habitable, wearable, smoky, pungent teepee to act as a refuge for upcoming possible mediums events. Ancestor to the primitive hut, hearth, roof, and foundation, and geometric distant cousin to the wigwam, a cone versus a dome, the teepee produces a rich material, formal, and programmatic primitive point of departure. The closing weekend of the exhibition began with a dinner including colleagues, mentors, and students from around the region. The event provided a unique opportunity to engage students in an intimate experience that expands the teacher-student relationship. The evening's events included a walking tour of the gallery and a series of informal discussions around the work exhibited, the ambitions of the project, and the state of architectural education. And so, as this second phase wrapped up, we've learned that a table is still a great place for discourse, that expanding mediums leads to new questions, that a science fair is a great format for an architectural critique, and that testing is important and wrong things can be right. And it is also important to remember what you learned. Parties are better than symposiums. Our third event was a symposium that we hosted at the Fisher Center in New York in November of 2014. It is our most buttoned-up affair to date, and while it was beneficial to formalize our positions as we move towards a publication, we were reminding that staging matters. But, alas, Possible Mediums has had and continues to have many after parties. It's made an impact at each of our respective institutions and at many of the institutions of those that were involved. The after parties, for example, have become institutionalized at my institution of Ohio State University, that the lecture series is now considered the lecture and workshop series, taking advantage of at times when we bring people in to allow students to have a longer, more intense and intimate interaction with that guest. At Syracuse University, Kyle has incorporated much of the work that we've been doing on possible mediums into his core course about media. He's also organizing a summer workshop series that will launch this summer. Adam Ellie Abrams and Andrew Holder at Michigan have just secured a large grant for their project, which they entitle Masterclass, which will be a new model of intensive collaborative learning that will take place over the next year that is based on the format of the Possible Mediums workshop and conference. Kelly Bair is working on a series at UIC entitled Odd Couples, where she is reaching out to disciplines outside of the architecture school within UIC to have conversations with architects and filmmakers, architects, writers, et cetera, in order to have a discourse about mediums. And finally, as I turn this back over to Adam, who will walk us through our proposed Possible Mediums curriculum, one thing that we've learned is that when the experience is intense, leaving is sad, but you can take it with you. Thank you.
So in the context of ACSA, this series that Kristy was referring to, I think, shows how these the original conference, the following events, and the project has had an impact and is having an impact, an ongoing impact at the universities that we all teach at. I think that we took the opportunity of this format, which I'd also like to thank David and Lola for that. Invitation to think bigger, to think more radically, and to, kind of conduct a thought experiment about, what if we had something bigger? What if we had our own school? We backed away from that a little bit. We did have some Google fun last night when we coined PMU, and we found this hat online with the mascot of the Margin Crushers, which we thought was important. And then it got better and better. So I don't know what this means, but I'd rather be riding my PMU horse. I think it might be applicable, but we thought instead to think about it as a possible mediums year. So hypothetically, you would take a year off from your education. Maybe this is a counterpart or an additional year that would kind of work like an externship, where you would come study with us, a gang of weirdos for a year, and the model would be based kind of like a music festival. So we took that way of thinking and started to make it into a proposal for a school or a temporary school. So if this is the typical campus layout, we would do something like this, which I think is more akin to, again, a music festival. And I'll come back to this. So this is the diagram of the schedule. So basically there would be the year would be broken up into 12 months. There would be 3 weeks of intensive workshops, and then 1 week of rest where you recharge. It would start with the science fair, the speed dating, when each of the 16 invited instructors come and present their work and basically do their first act of audience building by attracting students to work on their work. 3 weeks ends with a kind of pop-up exhibition and a roving jury conversation around the work, much like the Possible Mediums conference. And then you do it all over again. So you switch, you can repeat, but you can never take them all over the course of the year. There's always more happening than you can possibly access. This all happens out in the open. So these are the figures from the original conference, the kind of hanging chunks of meat, which are now turned into a stage, each with their own kind of figural profiles and personality. These would be the places where students would work in the open as a way of trying to capture the kind of collective energy of the original conference. On the top right is what we're calling the main stage, where we would invite figures from the outside to give lectures on maybe topical themes which were related to some of the workshops, but as a way of kind of supplementing the design workshops with more structured moments and talks when everybody gets together. So the structure of the courses would be in the top left diagram, which I'll return to, where, let's say, history, theory, representation, and design are kind of ganged together in one unit. And we have some, fun events like Parents' Week and Week 7. So what does this mean? I think that we're talking a lot about pedagogical models, pedagogical diagrams, the notion that you can, let's say, identify a core or curriculum in something like this, a hierarchical diagram which reinforces a center, which is meant to convey that all topics that could possibly be relevant are covered within the curriculum. In case that's not clear, arrows pointing to the core, to the curriculum. So we want to say that there's no core. Did you take my notes, Kristy? I can't memorize that much. So there's no core. And this is maybe as a way of also engaging the next panel, which is called the Core Curriculum Tomorrow. So to name an architectural core is to posit that the diversity of contemporary design can be traced to a single set of skills, histories, and intelligences. We believe this to be impossible. The diversity of work that we've witnessed through possible mediums cannot be traced to a fixed core. Each contributor defines for themselves the vital histories, precedents, techniques, and theories relevant to their own work. For us, and this is actually an observation that David made in relation to the project the first time he saw it, but the core is the hollow void between our projects. So if the discipline were a donut, this is roughly a donut shape, no one would be claiming the donut hole of a center. Similarly, no one would be looking to escape to the periphery of frosting. We exist in the fat, full, and tasty cross-section of the donut's middle. So this is, again, unpacking maybe that original diagram. So if we understand theory, history theory, media representation, and design studios to be separate courses and credit loads that are connected through these pretty tenuous and often non-existent dashed lines, we'd want to wrap that all into one kind of Mickey Mouse head where it's all overlapping. So that would mean no studios and no surveys. So with no studios, we would be moving to workshops. The workshops, I think, present some defining differences between that as a format and a traditional studio. The workshops produce collective creativity and authorship as instructors and students work together toward a shared outcome. Thus, there's no individual authorship. This runs counter to the traditional semester-long studio model, which is individual and personal. Although faculty introduce topics in studios, by the end of the long semester, students have made them their own. What begins as an external design prompt becomes an internal pursuit achieved through individual ability and argued with personal conviction. Add to this the typical review format where students attempt to present their work as infallible to a panel of superiors who pass judgment, and you get students taking criticism as personal psychological attacks. In a workshop, the compressed time frame and collective work doesn't allow students to personalize the prompt. Most often in workshop reviews, the instructor is the one being judged, which we think is a good thing, as they're more equipped to engage the colleagues and critics in thoughtful debate regarding the merits of their own work, and thus they model constructive dialogue for the students. Related to this, there's no surveys. Surveys imply something like history, theory, or representation can be packaged as a static set of historical events presented as a totality. At PMY, so it's not PMU, it's PMY, history, theory, representation, and technique are continually reworked, reframed, and represented in terms of what they offer contemporary design. Each instructor teaches their own history and representation subcourses, again, which is the ears of the Mickey Mouse head. And I think we also wanted to reference what John McMurrow said on Thursday night, to avoid the tautology of justifying architecture by claiming it's architectural. To this, we would add that history is not valuable by the mere fact that it happened in the past. Rather, its value is determined by its relevance and use value within contemporary design. And the same goes for representation, technology, and so on. So another thought we had in terms of the kind of use value for faculty would be that this program would be something like a residency or maybe a fellowship where they come from the outside. Nobody lives at the school. Everybody comes from the outside. So faculty come from the outside. It serves as a residency where they're getting outside of their conventional office or their conventional school and are allowed to kind of experimentally work on problems that are pressing for them. And the students similarly get out of their native environment, and instead of going and kind of doing a site visit as an office to see how kind of practice out there works, the two meet in the middle. And I think the experimental and collaborative environment is meant to loosen up both constituencies, let's say. So as an example of the pedagogy, I think for the kind of Mickey Mouse pedagogy, I think for somebody like Jimenez's workshop as an example, which Kristy mentioned, there's a set of canonical houses which are very much important, but are not necessarily important given the through the context of their through their original contracts or the ambitions of the architects, but for how they're useful to kind of rethink planimetric relationships within the kind of design prompt. And similarly, representation focuses on orthographic drawing, but also kind of cartoonish drawing as well. So we would say that like history is taught and representation is taught through the lens of the design prompt. All of that's related, and that would make up our credit distribution. So on the left would be a typical 30 credit architectural year where you get 3 credits for surveys, 6 credits for studios, and then us, which is the population of Mickey Mouse heads, all distributed 1 credit per block. So 1 credit for history theory, 1 credit for representation, 1 credit for design within the 3-week chunk. And you do it over and over again for 12 months. I just wanted to end with a couple maybe summary statements and then invite the panel up for discussions. So I think it's, our model might resonate with others, but there's a couple things that I want to say which I think are important for us as values, which is 2 things we're not, an opposite and a movement. For decades, the new in architecture has been defined as a negative, i.e. what it is not. It has been framed in oppositional terms, modern versus postmodern, white versus grays, critical versus projective, conceptual versus phenomenological, and so on. Our project is not defined by overcoming a single antagonistic opposite, but simply constructing more ways to approach and produce architecture. Possible mediums is a collection of positive assertions, willful acts of creation, and new terms and definitions added to the architectural mix. And I was thinking about this in relation to some of David's comments on Thursday about the core and periphery possibly being a temporal problem. And so I would say that I think possible mediums is in the business of multiplying presence, present times, not absence presence. The diversity of work is based on the same general set of historical events, theories, and techniques, but we're constructing diverse contemporary practices from them. There is no teleology, no ordained lineage of authoritative figures, only the multiplications of possible ways forward. Further, we're not a movement. Movements produce ideologues, zealots, and blind followers. They are argued with a metaphysical resoluteness that inevitably oversimplifies contemporary life and disallows thoughtful debate. Put another way, movements are bad discourse. We claim neither revolution nor undisciplined promiscuity. We're somewhere in the middle. We're impassioned individuals obsessively and rigorously develop their own projects, argue on their behalf, and maintain a commitment to dialogue and debate. The last not to proselytize or discount alternative approaches, but to mutually strengthen the work of our colleagues in the discipline of architecture as a whole. So I think when we began Possible Mediums, the middle was a fact of geometry. Over time, it's taken on epistemological significance for us. So in his book, The Order of Things, Michel Foucault describes how our understanding of the world is far from universal, but rather is determined by and changes with the history of thought itself. In each episteme, it is possible to think certain things and not others, a condition governed by the structure of knowledge, not by the nature of reality. And yet, between one historical moment and the next, there exists a middle region where things, perceptions, and thoughts are in flux. That is, where humans confront things outright before intuitions of similarity and difference pair with patterns of thought to impose order. This middle region is where objects precede systematic philosophies and historical narratives. It is a zone where the artifacts of design hold as much sway as the thoughts and theories of the designers. We believe this historical moment to be such a middle region. Thus, Possible Mediums Year will collect people, thoughts, provocations, objects, and images in order to capture this moment in the middle. Provisional headings such as objects, history, figure, projection, and parts group instructors with related interest and frame the content in relation to contemporary topics of concern, a structure which reflects our understanding in our attempt or ambition to organize contemporary architectural discourse. We approach the diversity of design today with neither cynicism nor divisiveness. Instead, we frame architecture's potential as simply and optimistically possible, while providing secondary categories that allow for more nuanced discourses to emerge. Possible Mediums Year is not a totalizing and systematic education, nor a banal slate of all design offerings. It is a teeming cauldron of potential, containing the seeds of architectures and knowledge to come. The middle is no longer the middle, it's the frontier. So that wraps it up. I'd like to invite the panelists up for our conversation. Can you guys hear okay? Yeah, okay. So I think that we prepared some questions, and also the panel, we're sort of all equals, but I think Kyle and Kelly have been involved in the conversation in the development of our fantasy school. So I think they might jump in with some questions as well. I think maybe to start as a prompt, which given that everyone at the table has participated in the workshop model, Brennan, Andrew, and Andrew at the original conference, I think we're trying to think about the limits of the workshop model. So, and that's why we are trying to take it to some kind of maybe more extreme endpoint and highlight the differences of it to the traditional studio model. And so maybe based on everyone's kind of personal experience of it, maybe thoughts, reflections on it as, I think, a supplement or an alternative to a traditional studio would maybe be a kind of opening point of conversation, if anyone wants to take that up. Sorry, I did that at the beginning, but I'm happy to do it again. So Kristy Balliet is my official or fellow moderator. Andrew Atwood from the University of California, Berkeley, Kyle Miller from Syracuse University, Andrew Holder from the University of Michigan, Kelly Bair from UIC, in Chicago, Brennan Buck from Yale, and I'm Adam Fure from the University of Michigan.
Hi, I guess, I mean, the workshops, the term, as we probably have all experienced, have been much shorter, and 2 to 5 days, something that would be that long. I don't know how you would get it. To me, it still seems a lot like what a studio would be, which I'm more comfortable with. Frankly, a 2 to 5 day workshop, I wouldn't say I'm opposed to it, but it has limits, and I think in terms of the way that I teach and the sort of flexibility that a studio allows to move and try things in different ways, rather than, I think there's this idea that the workshop allows for things to be kind of fast and loose and you can take chances, and actually I think in practice it becomes quite safe. There's a kind of pressure on the instructors, I agree, and then the way that ends up manifesting itself is a kind of pre-cooked process that's delivered to students, and they kind of operate a set of techniques, and I would say there isn't an ability actually to engage anything with any real depth, and things move so quickly outside of it. A month-long thing would be a different thing, but for me, that's a totally different, maybe a different animal, and not something that I've ever done. I've never taught a class that would be a month long. But I think the workshop thing, I think we like to talk about it as if it works in this way where it sort of allows us to kind of just throw stuff out there and try it. And it almost rarely, I would say it usually doesn't work that way. It has to be cooked in a way, and it produces safe results in a very, very narrow space, as opposed to this thing where you can kind of throw a lot of stuff out there and fail. Go ahead.
No, sorry.
No, I'm
I
happy
think
to sit back and.
I think there's like questions associated with it. So I mean, what I'm interested in is like the fact that the student, we're still trying to retain that the student doesn't produce an individual project. Like it's more, we're trying to maintain the kind of, I think, the more extreme effects of the workshop, which is like students absorb, never internalize, never sort of present the work as their own. And then in our model, they would go off back to their institutions. And that sort of would trickle out, which is basically what we saw happen from the original conference, where students would go back and they would, after 3 days studying with somebody from another institution at the conference, would actually change their thesis project and work on that for a year. So I think we're trying to highlight not like both the value of that form of learning. So like basically, I think it's repetition. I think it's fast paced. And I think it's collective. It's non-individual.
But I think it also comes, I mean, the evaluation of the workshop product is always on the kind of less polished image of the product after it's completed. I think if you look at the year-long model, that it becomes an iterative process for the faculty member as well. So there's a kind of micro component and a macro component to that. I agree, Adam. I think I can't even tell you how many of those puffy babies showed up on desks in like places around UIC after it happened, and like chunks of foam. And I think that the kind of extension even beyond the year, I think goes outside of the boundary of that particular schedule.
Yeah, so I'd like to jump in on the topic of workshops. So I think there's a kind of workshop mania that's not just sort of, not just specific to possible mediums, but is kind of endemic to the present moment. So all of us have now gone back and initiated workshop programs of various scales at our home institutions, and it's not exclusive to this group of people. I think nearly every institution has some kind of compressed time frame sort of learning format that supplements the standard studio curriculum. So I'm glad that it's kind of, it itself is sort of being brought up as a thing to interrogate. And I guess my point of view is that the workshop was not the workshop at the original Possible Mediums event. So I agree with Andrew Atwood that we all arrived with a kind of pre-cooked agenda for design, and then we worked with students so that they could easily replicate what we already knew we ourselves could do. So it was a very limited transmission of knowledge, but I actually don't think that was, the content produced was not the object in a way. It was the sense of like the encampment and the working on the institution, and that seemed to me like the real virtue of the workshop. So how to preserve that sense of being a kind of like quasi-welcome barnacle on the structure of a kind of larger established thing, like preserving the edginess of that attachment seems to me critical. And then preserving the kind of focused pedagogy only as the MacGuffin that lets you be the barnacle, that lets you be the kind of quasi-welcome interruption. So that seems to me like the reason that the workshop is of interest, not necessarily as a mechanism for like the transmission of knowledge itself. It's clearly a mechanism for repetition, but I think there are other things going on.
And it's really the collection of workshops that made the event and put on so much of it was about spectacle and I think of John McMurrow's talk on Friday, and the slideshow was all, I think, stock photos, and it's sort of a constant generator of great photography. But where I guess you mentioned Thesis, and I wonder if it's in a certain way, a way to rehabilitate Thesis, which has not gone away, but is in a bit of a crisis, I think. And the fact that you're working in this short time frame might actually generate enough contrast where if you do 12 workshops, there's some staccato rhythm of longer period of more self-directed investigation that then becomes more differentiated from studio and more you're collecting, if you do 12 of these workshops, you're collecting 12 approaches, and you would have a chance to then deploy or hybridize what you've done in a thesis.
Yeah, I think there's something along those lines that we talked about last night. Becomes a kind of productive disruption in a pretty aggressive way. That oftentimes these workshops that many of us are organizing and leading occur on the weekends. They're disruptive of other courses. They're not part of an official curriculum, and there's less ability for students to implement them immediately into their ongoing course content. So this kind of year of kind of aggressive sampling of methods, of techniques, of sensibilities, of histories, I think I also had made a similar comment last night that this becomes a kind of really productive precursor to thesis. We were imagining a scenario where a student comes and participates in, let's just say it's the objects cluster of workshops, and they do 16 of those, and they gain a really in-depth knowledge about the histories embedded within those projects. That's equally as productive as a student going through and sampling and finding new ways to create hybrids between the organizational structures that we've projected onto all of our collective effort. And I think by the end of it, it actually becomes personalized and internalized in a way that the students typically don't have the opportunity to in the regular curriculum sequence. So I think it's really an issue of that if it's a dedicated year, it becomes something much more significant and beneficial than the kind of weekend disruption, which is, of course, has been beneficial, but not in a kind of total way that really implements larger curricular changes.
Yeah, I would just add to that another part of the conversation we were having last night is that that this would not be necessarily supplemental to an education, but would somehow be integral to. So you'd have to do a PMY at some point in your architectural career, but that the student would be able to choose when that was in their curriculum, so it would mean that some students may take it as a capstone, as a final year, as a gap year, in which case they could kind of go into it with a specialized focus and understanding. They might know who the people are. They might know that they want to kind of study in a certain sequence. But at the other extreme, it could be as a survey. So a student, as a freshman or as a sophomore, would go, and it would be their introduction into this world. So much like a summer camp or a music festival that are there to sort of supplement one's kind of current context. Either you go to kind of specialize or to hone your fanhood for a particular band that you've already been honing over time, or you go to get a sampling of kind of what's out there. And what that would also produce is these courses, maybe I would, well, I'll end that it would be more of a vertical studio. So of those 10 to 15 students that would be in each session, you could have some that are in their first year, in their second year, and you could have some that are in their final year. So I think in terms of how you handle things like history and representation are going to kind of be challenged and changed a bit every time based on the dynamic of the collection of students.
Could there not be a Mickey Mouse? I mean, the other thing is it strikes me, could it be a snowman? Could it be, meaning, like, could it be, like, you're leaving out certain things that we find in schools, structures, building science, and, I mean, that's intentional. I know that you guys thought about that. So how would you swap those other things out? Could you do one that just doesn't have representation? I mean, it just doesn't even assume any kind of technique that's associated with it?
I mean, we were kind of, couldn't figure out what would be the most productive role-playing or fantasy to pursue. I mean, one is like, wouldn't this be great? And talking about like the personal experiences. Another was like, how are we going to get credit hours? Like we wanted to basically, present it with a little bit of attention to those details so that we could sort of make, set ourselves up in conversation with, I think, traditional curricula and just credit hour structures. I think, though, I want to throw out one other thing because I think that, and this maybe goes to Andrew Holder's point about the content of the workshop not being the objects produced, but the institution that is being worked on, which I agree with. But I also think, and this is a kind of observation that I've come to through witnessing the effects of these things, is I think that there's a new capacity within our students to retain skill sets, ideas, like incredibly quickly. Like this is the thing which I think is been most kind of profound to me, is to see the ability of students to basically internalize in like short time spans the work of somebody else, and then like enact that that knowledge or those thoughts or those intelligences like immediately. So I think that the format itself, and I think that this is a capacity within our students which I don't think was probably there. I think it has to do with speed of attention, speed of retention. I think it's tied to digital culture. And I think the workshop format, for me, kind of is a format which like activates that capacity in a way that I think the traditional studio just does not. I think it's based on old models of old models of knowledge, old models of authority and power, and I think that I think that to me is also part of the content, is new forms of design pedagogy which exercise other capacities in our students.
It seems like in the presentation today and the idea for the school or the year, where there's this complete unknown is what happens when you repeat that over and over and over again, where the event is not a one-time thing, but the 12th time that everybody stands up and you do the speed dating and everybody presents their idea for the workshop, we're going to do this, and it's infinitesimally different than what we did in the 11th time. I think that there's a, Kristen Shaw is this comedian who, I'm a little vague on the specifics, but she has this joke where she just tells it over and over and over again, and there's a uncomfortable sort of the laughter wanes and returns as it becomes more and more absurd. And so, I mean, that Mickey Mouse diagram as the single students sequence through the year is also the snapshot of all of these workshops at any one moment, and how they migrate toward each other or move apart, how they hybridize or split. I think that would be a sort of fascinating animation to try to chart, but then also just the way in which the whole structure, the presentations, the work itself gets mannered through the repetition, I think would be very odd and fascinating.
I think to build on that, one of the things we parallel this to was Groundhog Day. Like the fact that we would be allowed to continuously evolve and evaluate the work, which is also outside of the typical venue for the workshop, where it's always a kind of anomaly. It's always outside of a kind of regular rhythm and vetted series of events. And so if it's presented in sequence and repetitive and continuous, these minute alterations to that structure, I think, provide an incredible opportunity that hasn't been put on the table previously. So I think that's something we talked about, like to what extent do you run the same workshop 12 times because you're lazy, or do you make minor adjustments and really by the end of that 12th time you've done much more than a workshop because the evolution is equally important as the individual output.
Right,
But I'd imagine, yeah.
I think that I just keep an eye on the time, and I think it's a packed day. So I think at any point, if there's questions from the audience, please feel free to join in. So maybe let's let Kelly speak, and then.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I would imagine the context and proximity to other workshop leaders would be fairly influential on the development, as much so as the student production that would happen within that module. So it would be interesting to see the kind of infectious nature, because I think that happened a little bit in the conference.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm curious how resilient you think this model is that over the course of 12 repetitions, the students actually takes control, and it's less of a deliverer that absorbing model, and where how much risk can that instructor step back by doing 12 and say, this is no longer mine, this is part of our style.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we thought about in that scenario is that students start to travel together. So in fact, you partner up with one or two other students that you've enjoyed working with, and by that time you've collected a set of experiences that might alter the way that you perceive that setup. So 3 or 4 of you go into a workshop and in a way undermine the intention of that workshop. So again, that's something that's not possible given the way in which workshops are currently implemented, but that continuity and kind of aggressive overlap of all these things, I think, is something that would really allow for student ownership over the content, not in a way that they become the kind of celebrated individual genius, but in a way that's at the service of the kind of issues that are put on the table by the instructor. It becomes more collaborative in that sense.
Yeah, I guess I also would just want to push for clarity about what is being sold. So if it's the transmission of technique that's being sold, then I think the kind of answer to your question is that Andrew Atwood's right. This is a kind of repetition of the skill set of the teacher in the students to the point where distance between student and instructor collapses, and we're just doing a thing together. And that happens, as Adam mentioned, like very quickly. My problem with that is I think collectively we've been pairing that with a kind of discourse on the new and the novel, but that's not what it does. It collapses distance and it repeats quickly. So to me, what is being sold in addition to the kind of transmission of technique is like the euphoria of possibility. Like I can do this, I can do this, I can do this, which requires that kind of repetitive structure and the kind of clarity of choice in order to convey the euphoria. So for my money, the workshop and the transmission of technique is nice, but I don't think that's actually what's being sold.
Mm-hmm.
I got one comment just following on what Kelly said. I think one of the things that made this so successful as a participant in it was the 12 simultaneously happening in the same space, so that it's really ultimately professors who are being influenced by each other. Because I was influenced by all of you guys, and it's changed the way that I've taught, it's changed the work that I've done. So somehow in this model, you have to, if it is also the music festival model, you can't have the same people back. And
Right.
that's actually what would need to happen every year. There'd have to be different people, because it's that stepping outside, conflict, tension, collapsing, finding shared influences you didn't know you had, and then those things go back again. And that's, so it's actually in a weird sort of way, a kind of school for challenging teachers.
Sure.
In terms of their pedagogy than it would be as much for the students.
Yeah,
one
that's
of
how we had imagined it, that it would be a kind of one-year residency, and we would, people would propose
I think
workshops.
one of the things that, in addition to that, one of the things that made it great was there was almost no oversight. There was no power structure that operated above us. It was like the only people we were responsible to were kind of the other people that were teaching. That was the audience. It was at OSU. People were kind of, some of the senior faculty were kind of floating around, but really they weren't. And they were curious, but they weren't. I felt no pressure in that way. Like all of the kind of tension was sort of between us. And so it got charged. And that's what made it interesting. But it wasn't about sort of performing based on your boss being pleased with the kind of product of, which is important. And so it also raises questions. You guys keep saying we, who runs this thing, and is that also change? Things like that, because I think it really was, in some senses, non-hierarchical, at least amongst the instructors, and that was actually, in addition to the sort of proximity to other students, a really, really important part of it. And to me, frankly, when I showed up, it was kind of a relief that the stakes were, that they were sort of between as opposed to looking up.
What would you say is missing or is inadequate about existing institutions that you have to step outside? And are you willing to completely abandon the possibility of going to the inside and becoming the main? Is it necessary to keep refusing the crowd? To the outside?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, so, I think the thought experiment is indicative of maybe our conclusions to that question, which is like, could we actually imagine, is this a 3-year MARC, is it an alternative institutional model? And I think what we decided on is, well, we couldn't answer all those questions about how to institute the skill set to kind of enable the students to do the work that was maybe being put on the table through the workshops. But I think that so if we just look at the successes of the original conference, I think that there's a flexibility in topics of concern. So at our institutions, even though, they have a kind of critical mass maybe of young faculty doing interesting work, it was the kind of freedom and that Andrew spoke about, Atwood spoke about, in terms of there was no oversight. And that was a sort of kind of, in a way, a blank slate. So we could put, let's say, topics on the table that no institution would be able to adequately address, as a singular unit, just based on how hiring works, how tenure works. So I think that there's that agility from an institutional level, an inagility or an inability to kind of be agile and to work on new topics, that I think the conference model worked well for that. I think that, so I think that that's a big part. And then, I think that ultimately what we're proposing is not total. It is still supplementary, but it's like taking that barnacle and blowing it up to a hot air balloon so that it takes up more space and it affects institutions, but it is not a replacement. I mean, that's one of my thoughts on it. But
I think, of course, what we're proposing is a bit utopic, but to some extent, there has been an internalization of a lot of this in a pretty formal way. Many of us have received grants to implement these things in kind of vetted structures within the institution. Mine is going to be in the summer, so it's not totally internal yet. The one at Michigan occurs incrementally over the course of many years. I think there's ways in which this could creep into restructuring a kind of first-year curriculum, maybe in a non-accredited program where there's a bit more freedom to be flexible with content delivery. But I don't think it has to be always totally outside. I think this, of course, would be an incredible venue, atmosphere, experience. But I think there's ways in which that the empirical evidence that we've gained from all of our events could actually immediately, and has already begun to be implemented into kind of formal infrastructure of all of our institutions.
Josh.
It seems like
it's sort of like an accelerationist model of a workshop or a studio, right? Like especially the repetition, especially the intensity. I second Michael's point about, the notion of kind of like cycling through. But I think that has interesting implications in what Andrew was talking about in terms of hierarchy, right? Like, you can't have it sort of run totally freeform. It seems like there's interesting ways to think about how you could sort of have sort of like almost like a dampened hierarchy, right? Where like, let's say you run in and there's you get in and you do like 2 cycles of it, right? But 50% is in on their first cycle, 50% is on their second cycle, so there's like a crossover. There's like happening things. It seems interesting. One thought I had though in the context of accelerating things is it's very focused on sort of studio workshop-y, like addressing studio and workshop problems and things. But I'm also interested in the sense in how you could kind of accelerate the historical or theoretical, the critical, historical theoretical aspect into the model. Again, not as a replacement of the institution, but as a way of thinking about taking fragments of things that come out of the sort of conventional model and building them. I wonder what your thoughts are on how you might do something like that.
Okay. Well, I think it would maybe build on what Andrew said about does it have to be the Mickey Mouse, or could it be the snowman? Could those related topics sort of change in proportion depending on the conversation that the leader was having? So for example, I think of the kite from Flight from Brennan and David, like that certainly took on a lot of structural issues of tensegrity, and those types of things. That one thought could be that different conversations require an enlargement of things like structure, things like history, and that maybe also connected to something else we talked about is that maybe when you do it 12 times, it could be that you as the instructor actually change the proportion of those things, so that as you want to, you run it, you have a conversation, and you realize you need to infuse more history or structures or technology into that conversation, you could actually enlarge those elements in the next iteration of it and sort of change the credit hours. Then all of a sudden, that student who does it, they're going to get 1 credit for structures and 1 credit for, and maybe no credits for design. Maybe it becomes history and structures or something. So, I mean, we actually didn't talk about that so specifically last night, but when you brought up the snowman thing, I think that those things could certainly merge.
Yeah, I was struck by something that Adam said in his introduction, which was just kind of the phrase use value. And it seems to me like all of the constituent inputs of these conferences are solely evaluated on the basis of their ability to be useful, to the in-group. So, why would we even engage history and theory? Well, it's kind of to impress one another. That's what it's useful for in the context of these kinds of workshops, which is not to kind of diminish those things, but that's sort of what all the material, the available material is used for, is to kind of play the game in the hippie protest movement and then sort of go back to school afterward. Sure.
I would just like to, commend you on what you're working on, but I also would say don't talk yourself out of this stuff because it's sort of political and sort of hierarchical things that don't seem to jive. I'm going to practice for 35 years before coming back to teaching, and I'm amazed at the concrete aspect of academia. So I recognize that there's a problem there. The ability to change quickly and turn on time is really tough. But don't talk yourselves out of it just because the structure may have to come out. But I think that you could be a little clearer on stating what it is the problem is you're trying to solve. Because I think it's not real clear on yet. To me anyway, exactly. And some of that has to do with, where does this fit in, or what does it displace?
Yeah.
And then the last observation is that, you're still working with simulated material. And I guess one of my questions is why not work with more, full-scale material, which is a huge issue in education.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, criticism taken. I think that we, for this conversation, we're trying to focus on design pedagogy. So basically, I think you can extrapolate from the workshop model and the results we've gotten, maybe draw some conclusions or tease out some implications for like the epistemological model it enables or enacts, capacities of students, the ability to kind of take on new topics very quickly. It's really that, and I think that that's what we tried to focus on. I think maybe to circle back to Josh's question, I think that the content is flexible. I think we're trying to here highlight a structure that could swallow up different topics that could range. I think that our natural, like our proclivities lead us to design and a kind of maybe formalist strain of design, and that's the work is consistent, the design is consistent maybe in that way. But I don't think we're not implying that represents the totality of approaches to architecture today. So it's really kind of, we're trying to highlight the format.
So, I mean, I can see more distinctive contrast than the one between Fure and talk last night. The one versus the many. I think that this notion of genre, multiple genres, the way that you're talking about it, is starting to take this idea of the multiple and embedding it in student, which is a kind of move away from, let's say, a much older model, or away from apprenticeship, which you kind of, there's a singular mentor to multiple mentors. So in a way, I think what you guys are talking about, and what we've been working on days of the amending the institution, but it's actually about changing the way learning takes place, and maybe thinking about expertise in a very different way. That expertise is not necessarily about working on the same thing over and over again many times, but a different way of accumulating expertise, perhaps. But anyway, I was just wondering what your thoughts were about that. How does it maybe change the way that learning takes place for students and how expertise is understood?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about that earlier today and last night, that the kind of authority figures are not singular for everybody, and that with the absent core, or with the way that we've organized the donut, that each workshop, in effect, establishes its own authority figures, and then based upon the sampling that occurs by students across multiple workshops, they kind of develop their own understanding of authority figures across history. And I think the real promise is that there's this kind of hybridization of influence that occurs. So there's never a reinforcement of a singular power structure or a singular set of vetted authority figures, but instead the construction of completely new hybridized configurations of historical material, projective design strategies. And I think ultimately it really becomes a kind of bottom-up thing where the students are empowered to set off on their own trajectories that don't necessarily match any singular one that's being put on the table by any of us, but in fact represent their own understanding of the ways in which many can coalesce. So it does change I think it changes the way that students learn from the bottom up.
Dora.
So, a little bit getting back to what Josh was saying, but engaging this, what you just said, Kyle, is that, I mean, the power obviously is that there's a kind of informality that is overlaid into the more kind of aggressively rigid curriculum and the approach to curriculum. And this is interesting, but there, to me, and in my mind, it's interesting because there's also a word like expertise floating around, and there's ideas of kind of rigor and engagement at an advanced level, and I wonder if right now it's a little too medium, right? Like it's a little too much just the 1 year, let's silo each of these, whatever figure, we're going to choose to, to describe these things as spheres, the sphere of history and theory, the sphere, and I think that it would be potentially really interesting to start to imagine that you're not just kind of affecting the pedagogy of studio, but also probably how we construct the narrative for what architecture is, how this becomes something that I think galvanizes and changes potentially what we imagine the history of any one of these things to be, or the theory that I think is really being produced here. And, turn the terms around and make it about this kind of, advancement rather than, I think that the problem with the repetition, in my mind, is not just that you would need new people and that it would need a kind of fresh blood, but that the repetition starts to create a baseline of expectation that I think just plateaus, it just lines out, as opposed to saying, well, what would this be if it were possible doctorates or possible, right, in that way, and push it, and push it up, especially because it seems to me that it is more an academic endeavor of the academy and critical of the academy than something that, is just going to make bullshit.
Oh, sorry, you've had your hand up for a while.
I guess I'm curious around what I know there's been discussion about kind of flexibility about when this could happen in the course of the student's career, but I wonder if there is some sort of set of expectations about what the student is bringing to the experience. And I guess in some ways, Pat's comment about potential for this to maybe shape a first year curriculum brings up this question to me, since it really, and then that question really speaks to some of the previous comments about this really reshaping how you do think about the structure of architectural education, and because right now the way you're framing it is that students come to it thinking of this as this alternative thing that's a swerve away from the conventional curriculum structure, and so how do you reconcile that, and what are the principles?
I mean, I think your question sort of related to something I was thinking from someone earlier in this idea that I think the relationships that the students have with one another might start to create some authority, like the expertise that they develop together, and when they trade off and they start to band together. I think that's a lot of expertise, tricks, discourse would happen between the students talking to one another. I think it would change the climate of how offices are created, in terms of, they're not coming out of a particular school, because these students would be coming from schools all over the country. I think it would have large implications on that. So even though these are being led by the workshop leaders, I think the students would be taking on more responsibility for the discussions that they want to have, the types of expertise they want to develop, they want to share with one another. And I think that this would prepare them in a way for practice and impacting and connecting with people outside of the curriculum that they might be one of 30 for 5 years. They're already within this model learning to talk to one another, learning to shift conversations quickly. And I think that would have a big impact on what the students would bring to this dynamic.
With the possibility of affecting the culture of that cohort of students there, the fact that they would have common experiences and within the realm of the issues presented, they would make decisions and prioritize or be critical or whatever. I think we ought to be clear about the difference between exposure and expertise, because in any one of those buckets of things that are presented, there is a whole another process that needs to be guided to actually develop expertise in that, and that could be the role of a home institution,
Right.
where that is going. And I would say you might want to think about how we prepare those institutions to catch, because they can go back to extreme culture shock.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just curious, it seems that the whole idea of structural change comes from the lack of a certain content, of which it's hard to bring into the curriculum when it comes to the institution.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, I think it's related to Dora's comments. Like, I think it's a fair criticism that we didn't move too far away from the Bauhaus in terms of our geometrical imagination, in terms of how you would diagram structure or think of structure. I mean, I think that and that's maybe the Mickey Mouse thing, like there is within our proposal perhaps a kind of regulating mechanism which is built into the way we think about schools and structures and studios and credit hours and stuff like that, which is maybe a little bit handicapping or putting a cookie cutter mold around something which is a little bit more freeform and nebulous. But I think that the two are related. I don't think you would draw the conclusion that the problem is that architecture's lacks definition, but I think we are trying to kind of meet somewhere in the middle where the structure changes a bit and the kind of freedom of the definition of what can fit in terms of content also loosens up. And then I think the way we think about our individual projects, like it's never the same thing. Some events we produce are more successful than others, but we think of them as kind of temporary formations of a set of ideas, a collection of people and thoughts and images and objects that produce kind of momentary clarity and allow for a conversation, but that even that structure is never fixed. So in the Possible Mediums project, we're always trying to change the events to see what new ways we can kind of frame the work and talk about the work. Ellie.
Well, I think it's interesting that 6 of the 7 of you were educated at an institution at a time when there was maybe, if not one authority, a few pretty clear authorities. I was just thinking about
There was one. There was one.
David's comment on Mr. Redmond, and so I guess I'm wondering if the kind of maybe slightly nebulous problem that PMY might solve comes from a kind of a shift you've seen in architectural education since that time, or whether you view your own education within that authority or that model differently now than you did as a student. Because I think the fact that it's significant that 6 of you went to UCLA under Sylvia Labor in the mid-2000s. I mean, that should become on the table as a explicit thing. And I guess I'm curious about that. Like, is it something which has changed since the mid-2000s in architectural education, or something you have a different perspective on now that you're in the academy as opposed to students?
I would say one thing that I think, collectively took from that experience, which is absolutely still in Possible Mediums, is the curation of a discussion, but not necessarily understanding what so the kind of curation of kind of characters and anticipation of a certain dynamic, a certain tension that may develop. And I think that probably is certainly something that we take into the project. That probably only answers the first half of the question, though.
Probably a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say something.
No.
I think it's an interesting point. I think that again, we're not trying. I think this is largely that the way in which we're approaching the project, the way we formed it, has been a response to how we observe our generation operating. And I think that it doesn't seem like any one of us is invested, or any group of us is invested in arguing with the kind of metaphysical assurity of something becoming the next big thing, and then so we're trying to convert everyone else. I think there's an acknowledgement of a diversity and multiplicity within the field right now that we're trying to mutually, we're trying to organize. So again, it's not the kind of list of 29 genres which are kind of all fine and nobody's, everyone's existing in their own little pocket, but we're putting people into sort of loose mixtures so that this kind of cross-pollination can happen. So I would say, the project is trying to, we always play this kind of funny role of like, we're kind of like curators lost in the mix, so we'll be listed with the contributors, and then we'll have like curator at the end of it. We never know what to do with that. So we're trying, I think, to kind of enable and like promote, maybe is not the right word, but sort of move multiple people and projects forward as a way of, I think, diluting the authority and power figures that were kind of long for, it seemed, last night. I think we can do one more question, and then we should wrap it up. Sure, go ahead.
I'm coming to this as a complete outsider from the UK, totally unfamiliar actually with the American university system as it stands today. And I'm really surprised, actually. And I'm surprised for a couple of reasons. And this is just coming out at it because I'm completely an outsider. And one of the things I'm surprised about is how inward-looking you are. And I think there's a couple of ways that you can maybe be less inward-looking that would be really beneficial to the kinds of conversations that we have with this project. And one of the ways is the entire lack of communication or discussion about the professionalization of architecture, or even architecture and presentations we've had today. And that's one reference that I can sort of give you to maybe stimulate that discussion, which has its flaws and whatnot, like major flaws, is the London School of Architecture that Will Hunter is launching, which is an association primarily with practice. And what that's doing is it's actually challenging like ARB, RIBA accreditation processes. And I think that's one side of it. So the inward-lookingness is, I think, kind of problematic. And this goes back, I think, to the conversation about the fact that you're all in UCLA, or the majority of UCLA is not being educated, and that may mean that you need to sort of like branch out. The other side is that I think the inward-lookingness could be really interesting if you begin to start thinking about how within the structure of the system itself that you're proposing, that it's not necessarily about singular workshops run by singular individuals, but it's about coming together of multiple individuals who run singular workshops or singular studios that might have different lengths of time over the course of the year. And I think that that's really important for you as teachers, but also for students in particular who will not get kind of gestation time to really, I think, actually be as critical as you think that they will be in a 3-week workshop. And the reason why I say that is because of the AA model of business schools, which is literally around the world. I'm sure many of you maybe have taken part in it at some point, or maybe not, which has a very clear economic model for the AA that is useful. And what that does is it allows sort of like basically the AA to infiltrate institutions, steal students, and bring them into their sort of like institution, right? And what that does is it allows you to sort of sit down and say, okay, like one, you can't be so inward-looking. Two, it would allow you to sort of sit together and actually challenge each other a bit more. And also be able to be clear what kind of economic model that you're proposing as well, because I think that's something you haven't addressed at all, and maybe like is a big red herring for me. And then finally, I think it would be really interesting to be less, like all of these things mean that you should be less risk averse in what you're proposing, and really actually think a bit bigger about how you might challenge the profession of being an architect, and how you begin to educate students to be architects rather than being like someone that just sort of like sit down and produce some funky shit over the course of the week.
Thanks for your comments. I mean, I think that like, I think that it seems like we're fine with the inward-lookingness, and I would say that the conversations, and maybe this is an effect of the American Academy, are moving more and more towards professional preparatory mentalities, like that architecture is about preparing students for jobs. And I think I think most of us probably disagree with that. I think that inward-lookingness is what shores up a certain set of expertises or intelligences, a way of understanding the world, a way of understanding history and the discipline, which basically is the root of our potential agency in the world. So I think that you're honestly unfairly holding us. I mean, we're claiming, especially in this discussion, design pedagogy.
Is there any potential that you have as a group, like to actually challenge that in a more like, straightforward way and engage with the professionalization in a way that redefines what that might mean in a more like in a more structured
when we get our Sheldon Adelson to back our PMY, we'll address that.
I just want to add that, you know, I mean, it's nice. It gives us a good platform to fantasize about
Right.
what we'd like to do, you know, pedagogically. But I just, for the people who are here, this is also a bunch of massive, it's going to take fundraising. And so I'm happy to be a funder. Possible mediums and encourage other people to get the word out to get the money flowing. It's like the main thing.
We can pass around a hat before we leave today.
The PMU hat.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.